Hi everyone, thanks. Last speaker of the day, and so bear with me while I talk through. Thank you, Tim, for that. My main message I took from that was to go home and buy lots of canned goods. And that felt quite scary. And thank you, Paul, for the kind words you said earlier about me. It does feel a bit like the biggest exit interview in history, in recorded history, this presentation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what we've learnt about ourselves as the cold chain in the last few years and what I think it means about resilience in the years ahead, and building on the big picture themes that Terry and Tim have shared. Now, I'm conscious that I've got quite a lot of slides and there's quite a lot of builds, and this might be a bit painful, but hopefully this will work. Okay, so I'm going to do just a few moments of short indulgence, if you will, on the CCF, a project of which I'm incredibly proud, but then quickly talking through what's the cold chain done through crisis? Just a quick recap of the history of the last 2 or 3 years, and it will be a very, very quick recap. And then talk about very specifically the legacy of that. What have we learned about ourselves in that period? And what does that mean for what's coming next? But just as I say, so like 5 years ago, actually 2018, when I started working at FSDF, as it was called, and we became Cold Chain Federation, we came together at that point and agreed a new strategy for this organisation, including a refreshed modern identity for it. But that strategy was obviously more than just the name. It was really about understanding that we needed to provide a better story about what the cold chain is. Because I didn't know what the cold chain was before I became the chief executive of the organisation that represents it, and I felt that actually, quite clearly, we needed to tell more people about it. What I didn't know then was that what we called ourselves and what we were was the right voice at the right time for what was a period in which what we do was more high profile than it's ever been, certainly in sort of modern memory anyway. In that process, our profile as an organisation has grown exponentially. Our membership has grown, it's doubled in that time, and we've got a platform now that we can build on as we talk about the years ahead and the themes that we're hearing about in this session. So, cold chain through crisis, I'm probably the only person that's going to tell you the story of the COVID years through the story of frozen food stocking levels. But it's a very important way of looking at it. But quickly to summarise, what did we have? We had the decision of the UK population to exit the largest single market trading bloc in the world, plus the global COVID pandemic, plus a war in Europe came together, and that led to changed buying patterns, labour shortages, and the energy crisis. That, and obviously, consequently, we've seen price inflation, supply chain disruption, and changed customer behaviours. Now, sort of breaking that down, and I'm not going to dwell on this, I'll share these slides with everyone and you can use them if they're useful to you in other ways at other points. But really, what we started doing, actually, at one point, was to track what the capacity was of frozen. I'm talking very specifically here about frozen food, just to simplify things, of what the stocking levels were like through the period. So as we saw in 2019, we sort of start to see this sort of very significant stock build, and we start to see that actually we were building up quite a significant anticipation of need for frozen food. It's really annoying. And but then we saw actually through that period, 2019, 2020, incredibly full cold stores. Literally, there were points as we got to sort of the end of 2019, 2020, where we genuinely were saying we don't think there is actually any more space here to put frozen food in storage. And that then played us through the sort of no-deal dramas of the end of 2019, and then in 2020, suddenly the COVID pandemic hit us, and there was just a huge amount of action needed, just literally to put head offices overnight into home working, to close down whole chunks of supply chain, open up, and deal with huge surges of demand in other parts of the chain, and just generally react very, very quickly to all of those situations. Then obviously we saw that, and then as we got to the end of that first year and we got used to sort of the things, we then had the very, very dramatic brinkmanship over the end of the Brexit negotiations. And then you go into 2021, and we saw the starts of the murmurings around the war in Ukraine, and then it broke out at the start of 2022. And so what we really saw here in 2021 was really the really chaotic period, the openings and reopenings, but then not opening, and then the standing up supply chains and then shutting them back down again, and all the different changes around that, and how we had to deal with that particularly chaotic period. But then in 2021, 2022, actually, so this time last year when we met, we'd come out of what I think was really the dangerous phase, where actually the consequences of all the things we'd done in the previous 2 years started to play out in food price inflation, played out in energy costs, and also political dramas from there. And now that brings us up to now, where I've used the phrase, so shoot me because I don't like using it, but are we in a new normal phase? Probably not. We're actually in a bit of a kind of, we're waiting to see how things are settling down and what's going to emerge as kind of normality from here. But really what I guess I'm trying to illustrate through that is just to sort of remind ourselves that we've been through a lot. It's gone through very clearly defined phases, and we've had to understand, and we need to unpick, and there's a lot of work to do going forward to unpick what we learned about the different elements of our supply chains during that time. But ultimately, what we're talking about here, it was a moment. We mustn't. And I was incredibly proud that I was able to be a voice for you at that time, when it was cold chain that was helping, very, very importantly, to get the vaccine out into the population, with some of the companies that we heard from last year, for example, and also, through the kind of dramas of the COVID period, we kept food supplies going, and that I think was something of which I'm very, very proud. And of course, that idea that we're not hidden anymore. But so what have we learned? Well, the first thing, and actually, this is where I actually differ from you, Tim, and this is where I think we need to have a bit of a beer and a debate about this. The main lesson I take from the last 4 or 5 years is that cold chains cope. The main thing, and there was a lot of media talk, a lot of drama, a lot of anticipation of things falling apart, and it never did. And it's pretty heavy. Okay, right. Well, let's hang on a minute. This is my stage now. We'll get onto it in a minute. We'll get into it. So yeah, and basically we asked our members in the Cold Chain Report 23, and thank you, Clive, for the plugs for that report earlier. It's there on a QR code. I love QR codes. You can see why we've got so many QR codes. By all means, download the report using that QR code there. But what we asked our members tell us is that yes, we've emerged from this period feeling more resilient and more robust, and feel like we understand a bit more about some of our supply chain vulnerabilities. However, that doesn't mean, and the other thing that we learned during that period is that collaboration is possible. Collaboration happens all the time. It wasn't like it didn't happen before the pandemic period, but the amount of collaboration that happened through those different phases just really, really stands out as a lesson in what we can do when we come together. So whether it's the collaboration between industry and government, and we have to thank the government for what they did do right during that period, whether it was the furlough scheme, the interruption loans, the ones that weren't defrauded, and the energy price guarantee. These things basically were lifelines for UK PLC and for our sector as much as anybody else. It kept our people in their homes and kept them, gave the security at a time when we needed it, and we were able to collaborate with them on that. And also the collaboration within the industry, collaboration between the cold chain companies in this room and their customers, but also the horizontal collaboration. So many great examples of sharing of resources, sharing of intelligence, sharing of problem solving in that period. And that's an era that we shouldn't forget as things start to return to normal, because there's so much to do. One thing that we talked a lot about, and I sort of, it's kind of my job to stand on platforms and say, we learned during the pandemic that it's really important to put more products into storage, because storage is really important. This idea of the just-in-time versus just-in-case, and the balance towards more just-in-case strategies to help to get more product in the supply chain. Actually, I think the reality is that whilst we did see a lot of that in that kind of period, anticipating no deal Brexit, etc., that really we've actually seen everything over this period, and there's no real kind of definitive view of what the right supply chain strategy is for different businesses coming out of the period. But what we did learn, and I think Paul said this earlier, and I think it came up at different sessions, is that what you do need is certainty of relationships with your supply chain. Customers, whatever that retail, whatever the customer is, the supply chain, having a good contractual, robust relationship and certainty with your supply chain partner is key to dealing with the situation. And hopefully that is a legacy that we won't lose and we won't forget in a hurry, even if we are sort of seeing differences of approach to inventory management. The other thing that we did see, and I think that was very, very much stood out during the period and is still a legacy of COVID, is this idea of consolidating ranges. Now, the rise of the discounters, the growth of the discounters, which was already happening before the pandemic, but since then, the simplification of ranges that we've seen play out in fresh food and frozen food across the major retailers. This kind of simplification of SKUs, reduction of SKUs, we saw the advantages of that through the crisis periods of COVID and also through some of the inflationary pressures that we're seeing. And that, I think, is a question that needs to continue in a conversation about efficient and resilient supply chain. And then we also learned that our labour pool is shallow. We are certainly not in a position standing here today that we were this time last year with our concerns around driver availability and warehouse labour, because demand levels have dropped. We've heard some of the stuff about PwC earlier. But we do know that, actually, I think Chris said it very, very clearly from this stage earlier, we don't necessarily feel as though we can be guaranteed that when it comes to the next demand surge, that we have the labour market available to us to do what we do. We have an ageing workforce. We have less flexible and temporary labour options because we're no longer able to draw on European labour in the way we were before. So we must invest in attracting and retaining skills and talents, and I was delighted that Bethany and colleagues were all talking about that earlier. And we must invest in alternatives to human labour. We must think about automation. And again, really powerful messages this morning, not just crane stores, big, large crane stores, which of course there is a great value in, but just automating processes to reduce the amount of work hours needed from human labour within supply chain. We also learned that our energy market is insecure. And that probably is the thing that underpins potentially the biggest risk of food security as well, is that insecurity in our energy market. I remember I was at the Global Cold Chain Alliance conference last year, and they were talking about the concerns about increases in electricity prices, and they were talking about things like 35p a kilowatt hour or 35 cents a kilowatt hour being a real drama. And I was able to tell them that we were looking at 80, 90p kilowatt hour potentials at the end of 2022, and that was our reality until the government stepped in. And the other thing is that we went into last Christmas with the genuine possibility on the government infrastructure planning that the lights could go out, that we might have rolling blackouts. It didn't happen, and actually we didn't get close in the end, but it became a genuine communication strategy of the government to start talking about what we do in that scenario, and that is something that isn't necessarily going to go away. Then. We also learned that UK governments will intervene. I think one thing that the UK government has done with furlough, with the energy market, is they've shown, and that's addressed to the UK and Western governments, that they will step in because they won't allow markets to fail. We also saw a major step forward in investment in renewables, other site efficiency, and obviously a significant increase in investment in things like solar. But also, another thing that we saw was, with energy getting so expensive, that there was a massive improvement in energy efficiency. And I think Clive showed some stats earlier that we need to sort of unpack a bit more. Actually, there's been quite a significant step change in the COVID years, in the energy efficiency last year around improving energy efficiency in cold stores, because people actually were doing things like shutting doors and doing the kind of housekeeping stuff because they were so concerned about the high cost of energy. And then obviously the final thing we learned is that crisis actions, the furlough money, the energy support and everything has consequences. And that led us into the high food price inflation that we have now. And reassuring to hear PwC saying that they think inflation will drop dramatically in the months ahead. So what's next? So those are the kind of COVID specifics around understanding about ourselves and resilience. So then we talk about what's next. And back in the Theresa May government, remember her? There was some talk about what are the government's grand challenges, and there were 4 of them, of which I think 3 are here. One is this idea of the ageing society and all the different things that come alongside that, and whether that's what we saw during the pandemic was that older people became familiar with online shopping in a way that they weren't before, and that is a legacy that stays with us. Or we had single-person households, people working older within our workforce, and people that we service. It's all got very ominous, that sound. Then there's clean growth, and this idea, which is another way of saying net zero, and this idea of meeting zero, decarbonising our energy grid, dealing with mobility and the future of transport, and the scrutiny of our supply chains and our food miles, which is the sort of thing that Tim was talking about and Matt and Terry. And then the AI revolution, the automation revolution that is really playing out. And I was at a conference in Australia last month, hearing from someone who was just talking us through, just spent 40 minutes explaining to me, or explaining to the audience about all the different AI tools that are available that have come on stream in the last 3 months. And I think it was the point in my life when I realized I was middle-aged. But that's going to play out in ways that we don't know yet, and but are going to really change a lot of what we do and how we do it. And then the final one, which wasn't in the government strategy back then, and probably was the sort of thing that's re-crept on a post-Brexit Britain, is this fact that the world's so unstable. You know, UK's outside Europe now, but there's geopolitical instability, the war in Ukraine, all these different things playing out. And that's going to be a geopolitical tension, an economic tension, and a trade tension between markets. And I know Terry and his colleagues have talked a lot about what might happen if China has tensions ratchet up, and what happens with Australia's food might come here, and there's concerns around what that means for us. Across those 4 themes, my point really, I'm not going to go into all of them, haven't got time and whatever, I'm going to talk about one of them only, briefly, is that cold chain is vital. We're at the centre of all, we are relevant in all 4 of these spaces that will impact on us, and we will impact on them. And the more that we are proactively thinking about these things in these areas, the more we will be doing what's right for our businesses and for our customers. So I'm going to talk only about, finally I'm going to talk about energy, because that's obviously the thing that probably stands out more than any other for us as an organisation, and talking about energy use across the piece, fossil fuel use, I should say. So let's be clear about net zero. Net zero means we decarbonise our electricity grid. That's why we've been a world leader in climate change up to now, by the way we've reduced fossil fuel use on our grid. And the idea is to take that down even very dramatically, not by 2050, but by the mid-2030s. That means disruption to our energy grid. That means disruption to the way our energy systems work. And that has consequences for how what we can rely on in terms of the energy that we need to do our job. And so that means, so the essay question that poses is, how does the UK remove fossil fuels from the UK energy grid whilst dramatically increasing our electricity demand, and at the same time maintain both the affordability of energy and resilience? And we don't have a good answer to that question. The politicians haven't got a good answer to that question for you. So you need to start thinking about what your answer to that is for yourself as an individual business, and how we do as a sector. So implications for us, I'm nearly done, is energy insecurity. Not quite as dramatic or as perilous as Tim's putting it out there, but energy insecurity nonetheless. Potential for blackouts. You know, California right now is dealing with their rolling blackouts. South Africa has energy turned off far more than it has turned on, and so this is happening in markets around the world, and it will be something that becomes more of a feature as we rely more on renewables on our grid. We've got an unpredictable energy market as a result, also because of the geopolitical tensions. We need the plan to rebuild the national grid is so ambitious. It's so ambitious, and yet it's not clear that they're really making much progress on that. And we all feel the experience of that when we've tried to connect solar panels or whatever else to a national grid. And we've got on top of that the warmer, unpredictable climate to deal with. Plus new regulatory burdens. You know, if the government follows through and doesn't abandon net zero in the coming 5 years, and I don't think it will, even if there will be some mutterings around the edges, we hit, and I think Alan McKinnon told us this at our conference in February, we're about to hit the austerity years when it comes to meeting the net zero target. Where the sorts of things that are promises for the future will become the reality in the coming 10 years. Carbon emission reporting will ramp up. Transparently, basically, your energy, what energy you use and what you pay for it, it's going to start to become public knowledge. And it's one of the most competitive things that we have in our industry. It's going to become public knowledge within the next 20 years. You're not going to be able to keep it a secret anymore. Diesel engine bans, tougher equipment and construction standards, and the phase out of F-gases. All of these things are going to ramp up on us. And obviously the consumer expectation of what we do, focusing on the net zero promises that our customers have made and our businesses have made, media and customer supply chain scrutiny, and the dominant and divisive issue around what net zero means. So, what do? Well, you do what you have to do. All you can do in this scenario is control the controllables. Use that energy, generate and store more energy of your own, plan ahead and communicate well about what your plans are to your teams, to your customers, and everyone else. Simplify operations wherever possible to try and reduce the complexity in your supply chains and your operations. Buy well whenever you're buying buildings or equipment. Think about how they're going to last you for the next 10 years rather than the short-term capex. and look after what you have. Says me, who's never run a cold chain business in my life. And it sounds easy, doesn't it? And the one thing, and this is something that, whoever asked the question earlier, and I'm looking for you, and I'm going to find you. The one big idea that is a controllable opportunity that we as a cold chain federation and the Global Cold Chain Alliance and our other national associations and colleagues in this room, we can make a difference on, really quite simply, is this idea of what temperature we hold frozen food at. And it's an issue that actually in my first board meeting, I think James Wood was here in the room and other colleagues on the board that day were like saying the one thing that we could do as a lobbying issue for Cold Chain Federation is get the country and the world and our customers thinking about frozen food temperatures. If we could change that, that would be a really significant boon. And I talked about it, I talked to people about it over 6 months, and I thought, this is a very, very hard mountain to climb in terms of people's attitudes. That has changed dramatically in the last 12 months. Nomad Foods, this last month, put out on their corporate website, in the name of their chief executive, this idea of raising freezer temperatures saves energy without food safety impact. They talked about a 10% improvement in energy consumption as a result of that. Then Unilever is someone, as I think Paul mentioned earlier, with their ice cream freezer trials. It's a simple idea, but it is actually a complex challenge. Firstly, it's not about what temperature you hold it at, it's about the temperature, what's the safe bands in which temperature moves through the supply chain. And that means the links in the chain, and we know that that is the hardest thing to manage in any situation. So it's really about having a safe benchmark to manage the links in the chain. But we can do that with the technology that's available to us now. And the other thing is that, and I think Paul said it very, very well earlier, stealing my thunder, was that it's a global regulatory challenge, but it's a global, it is built into the Codex Alimentarius, which is WHO. It's in there. It's not a formalised rule, but it's in there as a reference point. The UK Food Standards Agency, the European Commission, the US FDA, every local authority, every contract that everyone signed, all the quality standards that are going with products, they all have -18 as their benchmark, and every company and policy. So all of that, on top of 100 years of custom and practice, means that it's a simple idea, but it's a complex challenge. But if we did it, and we did it at scale, we would take a chunk out of our energy consumption in the cold chain, and we would, without doing anything in terms of new equipment or anything like that. It's just about thinking differently about our safety measures. And it's an issue that I take with me from working with you into the GCCA, and I'll be working with colleagues here at CCF and around Europe to try and bring this issue forward at pace, because I think it is something that we can do together that will make a difference. One thing you can control. Federation is here to help. I'm delighted to hand over the Culture Federation at the end of this year. We're here to help. We're here to share knowledge, net zero projects, etc., etc. We're here to represent you and be a strong voice in a range of things. And myself, Tom, and whoever comes beyond and further will be able to carry on with that ability. And we are here to provide tools like our benchmarking project, which I won't talk about now, but is something that I'm very, very proud of that we can help you with. So thank you all very much, and let's have some questions.